The 1996 naval comedy Down Periscope is built around an ensemble cast that blends television stars, seasoned film actors, and established comedic performers. At the center of the film is Kelsey Grammer, supported by Lauren Holly, Rob Schneider, William H., Macy, Bruce Dern, Rip Torn, and Harry Dean Stanton, among others. Each actor brings a distinct career history and performance style that shapes the tone of the film, which relies heavily on character-driven humor and exaggerated military satire. At the forefront is Kelsey Grammer, who plays Lieutenant Commander Thomas Tom Dodge, the unconventional submarine officer tasked with commanding a rusted, outdated diesel sub during a war game exercise. At the time of filming, Grammer was already widely recognized for his role as Dr. Fraser Crane in the television series Cheers and its spin-off Frasier. His background was primarily in sophisticated, dialogue-heavy comedy, rooted in psychological nuance and social satire. In Down Periscope, Grammer transitions into a more physical and situational comedic environment, while still maintaining his trademark dry wit and authoritative vocal delivery. His casting was a strategic choice. He brought credibility to the leadership role, while also subverting expectations by portraying a military commander who is both brilliant and deeply unorthodox. While the film did not redefine his career, it demonstrated his versatility beyond the polished intellectual persona he was known for, reinforcing his ability to carry a feature film in a comedic leading role. Opposite Grammer is Lauren Holly, who plays Lieutenant Emily Lake, a naval engineer who becomes both an ally and a grounding presence for Dodge. Prior to this film, Holly had already appeared in projects such as Picket Fences and Dumb and Dumber, where she balanced dramatic television work with mainstream comedy. Her role in Down Periscope reflects a period in her career where she was transitioning between television prestige and Hollywood films. Holly's character serves as both a technical expert and a narrative anchor, often reacting to Dodge's chaotic leadership style with skepticism and eventual admiration. This role helped solidify her image as a capable performer in ensemble casts, and shortly after, she would continue building her television presence, eventually joining long-running procedural dramas like NCIS, which became one of her most recognizable later career milestones. Rob Schneider plays one of the submarine crew members, delivering a kind of eccentric, fast-paced comedic energy that aligns with his background in sketch comedy. Before Down Periscope, Schneider had gained fame as a cast member on Saturday Night Live, where he developed a reputation for exaggerated characters and absurd humor. His role in the film reflects this comedic identity, contributing to the chaotic atmosphere aboard the submarine with physical comedy and rapid-fire delivery. At this stage in his career, Schneider was beginning to transition into leading comedic roles in films such as Deuce Bigalow, Male Gigolo. Down Periscope served as part of his broader evolution from sketch performer to bankable Hollywood comedy actor, reinforcing his niche in ensemble comedies built around exaggerated personalities. William H. Macy plays Lieutenant Commander Martin T. Pascal, a rigid and rule-bound naval officer who serves as a foil to Dodge's unconventional leadership style. Macy was already an acclaimed character actor by the mid-1990s, known for his collaborations with the Coen brothers, particularly in Fargo, which would release the same year as Down Periscope. His career was defined by grounded, often anxious or morally conflicted characters, and this role fits neatly into that pattern. Macy's presence adds dramatic weight to the otherwise broad comedy, giving the film a sense of balance between absurdity and realism. While Down Periscope was not a defining role for him, it contributed to his consistent presence in major ensemble films during the decade, reinforcing his reputation as one of Hollywood's most reliable supporting actors. Bruce Dern portrays Admiral Yancey Graham, representing the stern and traditional military establishment that stands in contrast to Dodge's unconventional tactics. Dern's career spans decades, with notable roles in films such as Coming Home and The Great Gatsby. Known for playing intense, often authoritative or unstable characters, Dern brings a sharp edge to the comedic military hierarchy depicted in the film. His performance anchors the institutional pressure within the narrative, embodying the old guard of naval discipline. At this point in his career, Dern was already considered a veteran character actor, and Down Periscope allowed him to exercise his ability to play authority figures with both seriousness and subtle comedic undertones. Rip Torn, who plays Admiral Yelland, adds another layer of military authority, but with a more volatile and unpredictable energy. Dern was known for his powerful screen presence and ability to oscillate between comedic absurdity and intense drama. His later role in Men in Black would cement his reputation for playing high-ranking, slightly unhinged authority figures. In Down Periscope, he contributes to the film satire of military bureaucracy, embodying the frustration and rigidity of command structures that Dodge continually disrupts. Harry Dean Stanton, appearing in a supporting admiral role, brings his signature understated and world-weary presence. Stanton's career included iconic roles in films such as Alien, Paris, Texas, and Repo Man. His casting adds a layer of cinematic gravitas, even in a relatively small role. Stanton was known for elevating any scene he appeared in, often through minimal dialogue and expressive silence. In this film, his presence reinforces a sense of a long-established naval world filled with seasoned officers who have seen decades of military evolution. Other supporting cast members, including Dwayne Martin and additional ensemble actors portraying submarine crew members, contribute to the dynamic group energy that defines much of the film's humor. While they may not have been major stars at the time, their performances help create the sense of a dysfunctional but ultimately capable team. When examining the cultural impact and historical significance of Down Periscope, it is important to set expectations realistically. Unlike major comedy landmarks that permanently reshape pop culture, this film occupies a more modest but still meaningful place within the broader landscape of 1990s American comedy. Its influence is less about direct cultural transformation and more about how it reflects the comedic sensibilities, military perceptions, and genre parody trends of its time. Released in 1996, Down Periscope arrived during a period when Hollywood was increasingly experimenting with parody films and workplace comedies that place eccentric protagonists into rigid institutional environments. The military setting had already been a frequent target for satire in earlier decades, but this film specifically focused on naval submarine warfare, a subject that had previously been treated with seriousness and tension in films like The Hunt for Red October. By contrast, Down Periscope intentionally flips that tone, turning submarine command into a chaotic, improvisational, and often absurd competition between misfit crews and rigid authority structures. Culturally, the film contributed to the broader 1990s trend of humanizing and mocking elite institutions. The military, corporate workplaces, and government agencies were commonly portrayed in comedy as systems that could be undermined by unconventional thinkers. In that sense, the film aligns with other comedic narratives of the era that celebrated anti-establishment ingenuity over formal hierarchy. The protagonist, a non-conforming naval officer commanding a deliberately outdated submarine, embodies the decade's fascination with the idea that creativity and flexibility could outperform strict adherence to rules. While Down Periscope did not generate widespread phrases or iconic catchlines that entered everyday language, it did help reinforce certain comedic archetypes that continued to appear in later films and television shows. The brilliant but unorthodox leader trope, already familiar in cinema, is exaggerated here in a naval context. This character type will continue to evolve in later workplace comedies and ensemble casts where authority figures are portrayed as both flawed and unexpectedly effective. One of the film's subtle cultural contributions lies in its depiction of military competition as entertainment. The central premise, a simulated naval war game between submarines, transforms a traditionally serious military exercise into a comedic sports-like event. This framing helped popularize the idea that even highly technical or strategic military operations could be interpreted through a comedic lens. While not the first film to do so, it reinforced a growing trend in the 1990s where audiences were encouraged to see institutions through a humorous, human-centered perspective rather than purely reverent or dramatic ones. In terms of historical significance, Down Periscope also reflects the post-Cold War cinematic environment. By the mid-1990s, global tensions that had previously dominated military storytelling were no longer the central focus of popular entertainment. As a result, filmmakers had more freedom to reinterpret military settings without the same geopolitical seriousness that defined earlier decades. The submarine genre, once heavily associated with Cold War tension, became fertile ground for reinterpretation and parody. This shift is important because it illustrates how cultural context directly influences genre evolution. Another aspect of its significance is its place within the evolution of military comedies. Down Periscope. Films like Stripes and MASH had already established the idea that military life could be a setting for satire. However, Down Periscope narrows the focus to a specific branch and environment, offering a more contained and structured comedic world. The submarine setting itself is inherently isolating, which amplifies character interactions and allows humor to develop from claustrophobic tension combined with absurd leadership decisions. Although the film did not achieve major critical acclaim or awards recognition, it has maintained a modest level of cultural presence through cable television broadcasts and home video circulation. For many viewers who encountered outside of its theatrical release, the film became a familiar background comedy, often associated with casual viewing rather than cinematic prestige. This type of long-term visibility, while less glamorous than blockbuster status, contributes to a film's endurance in cultural memory. In internet-era discussions, Down Periscope occasionally appears in conversations about underrated 1990s comedies or naval-themed films. However, it has not become a major meme source or viral reference point. Its humor is more situational and performance-based rather than built on easily isolated punchlines that translate well into short-form digital culture. As a result, its cultural footprint in the age of social media remains relatively limited compared to more iconic comedies of the same decade. Despite this, the film has influenced niche appreciation communities that focus on submarine films, military satire, or Kelsey Grammer's broader acting career. Within these circles, it is often revisited as an example of mid-tier Hollywood comedy that balances ensemble performance with structured genre parody. It is not typically regarded as a groundbreaking work, but rather as a competent and entertaining entry in a specific comedic category. Historically, the film also reflects the casting strategies of 1990s Hollywood, where television actors were frequently transitioned into film leads. Kelsey Grammer's role is emblematic of this trend, demonstrating how studios leverage established television popularity to anchor theatrical releases. This practice helped bridge the gap between TV audiences and film audiences during a time when the two mediums were more distinctly separated than they are today. The production of Down Periscope reflects the kind of mid-1990s Hollywood studio comedy filmmaking that relied heavily on controlled set environments, ensemble coordination, and carefully timed improvisational humor. While the final film presents a seemingly chaotic and loosely structured comedic world aboard a submarine, the actual production required a high level of planning, technical design, and coordination between cast, crew, and production designers to simulate the confined and mechanically complex environment of naval life. One of the most important behind-the-scenes challenges of the film was creating a believable submarine interior that could function as both a realistic military setting and a flexible comedic stage. Unlike action-heavy submarine films that prioritize authenticity and tension, this production needed sets that could accommodate exaggerated movement, physical comedy, and wide ensemble interaction. As a result, the submarine interiors were primarily built on sound stages, allowing walls and compartments to be adjusted, removed, or repositioned depending on camera needs. This flexibility was essential for capturing group scenes where multiple comedic beats occur simultaneously in tight quarters. The design of the submarine itself played a major role in shaping the film's tone. The fictional vessel commanded by the main characters is intentionally portrayed as outdated and worn down, which gave the production design team creative freedom to emphasize rusted textures, cramped hallways, and mismatched equipment. This visual language reinforced the idea that the submarine is a neglected, underfunded relic rather than a cutting-edge military machine. The set design also supported the film's central comedic premise that an unlikely crew is forced to operate a dysfunctional vessel under high-pressure conditions. Filming within such confined spaces presented logistical challenges for both the cast and the camera crew. Traditional camera setups had to be adapted for narrow corridors and low-ceiling environments. This often required the use of handheld cameras or compact rigs to allow movement through the submarine sets without disrupting the illusion of realism. The cinematography team had to carefully balance visibility with spatial restriction, ensuring that the audience could still clearly follow ensemble interactions, even in crowded scenes. The ensemble nature of the cast added another layer of complexity to production. With multiple comedic performers working within the same scenes, timing became a critical factor. Many sequences require precise coordination to ensure that dialogue overlaps, physical gestures, and reactions align correctly for comedic effect. While the film was scripted, there was also room for improvisation, particularly from actors with backgrounds in comedy television and sketch performance. This blend of structured dialogue and spontaneous humor contributed to the film's energetic and unpredictable tone. The director's approach to the material emphasized rhythm and pacing over strict realism. Instead of focusing on military accuracy, the production leaned into caricature and exaggeration, allowing characters to behave in ways that prioritize humor over protocol. This creative decision shaped not only the performances, but also the editing process, which had to maintain a consistent comedic flow while managing multiple intersecting storylines within the submarine environment. One of the notable production challenges involved coordinating exterior sequences, which were used to depict submarine movement, naval exercises, and competitive scenarios between different vessels. These shots often required model work, water tank filming, or carefully staged maritime footage. Integrating these exterior elements with the interior soundstage scenes required careful continuity planning to ensure that the fictional naval exercise felt coherent and visually consistent. The film also benefited from collaboration with naval consultants to provide baseline authenticity for uniforms, terminology, and operational procedures. However, these realistic elements were intentionally softened or exaggerated for comedic effect. The production team walked a careful line between respecting military structure and subverting it for humor, ensuring that the film remained recognizable as a naval setting while still functioning as a parody. Costuming played an important supporting role during production. Military uniforms were designed to reflect rank hierarchy clearly on screen, which was essential for both narrative clarity and comedic contrast. The visual distinction between rigid, polished officers and more disorganized or unconventional crew members helped reinforce character dynamics without requiring extensive exposition. This allowed the film to communicate hierarchy visually, even in fast-paced ensemble scenes. Another behind-the-scenes aspect worth noting is the reliance on physical comedy staging. Because much of the humor depends on spatial interaction within the submarine, scenes often required precise blocking. Actors had to navigate tight corridors, climb ladders, operate mock control panels, and react to simulated mechanical failures, all while maintaining comedic timing. These sequences were often rehearsed extensively to ensure safety and consistency, especially given confined set conditions. Lighting design also played a crucial role in shaping the atmosphere of the film. Submarine interiors are traditionally dim and industrial, but the production had to balance realism with visibility for comedic performance. As a result, lighting was carefully adjusted to maintain a slightly brighter and more readable environment than a real submarine would typically have. This subtle adjustment ensured that facial expressions and physical reactions remained visible to the audience, which is essential in comedy filmmaking. Post-production editing was another key phase where the film's comedic identity was finalized. The editing process involved selecting takes that best balance timing, reaction shots, and ensemble rhythm. Comedy editing often depends on micro-adjustments in pacing, and even small changes in shot duration can significantly affect the impact of a joke. The editors work to maintain a steady comedic cadence while ensuring that the narrative progression remained clear. The narrative of Down Periscope is structured as a classic underdog sports-style competition film. Even though its setting is a naval war game, at its core, the story follows a deliberately unconventional submarine commander who is assigned to lead a crew of misfits aboard an outdated diesel submarine during a high-stakes Navy exercise. The structure is straightforward, but it is built to emphasize contrast between institutional rigidity and improvisational leadership, with comedic escalation replacing traditional military drama. The film begins by introducing Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dodge, a naval officer whose career has been marked by repeated setbacks due to his nonconformist behavior. From the outset, the narrative establishes him as a figure who does not fit within the strict hierarchy of the Navy. This setup is essential because it immediately frames the central conflict, Dodge versus the system. The early portion of the film is focused on his selection for a seemingly impossible assignment, commanding a decommissioned, obsolete submarine during a large-scale training exercise involving advanced nuclear submarines. This assignment functions as the inciting incident of the story. Rather than being a punishment in the traditional sense, it is also a hidden opportunity. Dodge is given command of a vessel that is expected to fail, along with a crew composed of individuals who are similarly considered unsuitable for elite service. This setup introduces the film's primary narrative engine. An underdog team placed in a structured competition, they are expected to lose. The narrative then transitions into the formation of the crew dynamic. Dodge begins assembling his team, each member representing a different type of naval misfit or eccentric personality. This segment of the story functions like a recruitment montage in a sports film, where individual characters are introduced and gradually integrated into a functioning unit. The pacing here is episodic, with each new crew member adding a different comedic or functional dimension to the submarine's operation. Once the crew is assembled, the story shifts into preparation and training. Dodge begins transforming the outdated submarine into a surprisingly effective competitor. This phase of the narrative is important structurally because it establishes the film's central comedic paradox. A vessel designed to fail becomes increasingly competent through unorthodox methods. The humor is driven by the contrast between expectation and outcome, as well as the growing tension between Dodge's methods and the Navy's official doctrine. The middle section of the film is dominated by the naval exercise itself. This is where the narrative expands into a series of competitive encounters between Dodge's submarine and the more advanced vessels. The structure here resembles a sequence of episodic challenges rather than a single linear conflict. Each encounter tests the crew's adaptability, forcing them to rely on improvisation, deception, and unconventional tactics to survive and succeed. A key turning point occurs when Dodge's submarine begins outperforming expectations, surprising both his crew and the observing Navy command. This shift in narrative momentum redefines the central conflict. It is no longer about whether the crew can survive, but whether they can continue to outmaneuver technologically superior opponents without being disqualified or shut down by the authorities overseeing the exercise. As the competition escalates, the narrative tension increases between Dodge and the more traditional officers who represent institutional authority. These figures view his success as illegitimate or disruptive, and they begin to scrutinize his methods more closely. This introduces a secondary layer of conflict. Not only must the crew compete against external opponents, but they must also navigate internal political resistance within the Navy's structure. The climax of the film centers on the final phase of the exercise, where Dodge's submarine is positioned against the most advanced and strategically favored opponent. This final confrontation is structured like a decisive match in a tournament. The stakes are both professional and symbolic. Success would validate Dodge's unorthodox leadership style, while failure would reinforce the belief that strict discipline and technological superiority are the only paths to success in naval operations. During the climax, the narrative relies heavily on coordinated teamwork and accumulated experience. The crew must execute a series of complex maneuvers that depend on timing, trust, and improvisation. The submarine's outdated systems are pushed to their limits, forcing creative solutions rather than standard procedures. The tension is built through a combination of external pressure from the opposing vessel and internal challenges within the crew itself. The resolution of the film comes when Dodge's team successfully outmaneuvers their opponent, completing the exercise in a way that defies expectations. This victory is not just tactical but ideological. It challenges the assumption that efficiency and success are exclusively tied to modern technology and strict adherence to protocol. Instead, the narrative suggests that adaptability, creativity, and leadership flexibility can be equally powerful. Following the climax, the film moves into a brief resolution phase where the consequences of the exercise are addressed. Dodge's success forces the Navy establishment to reconsider its evaluation of his methods. However, the resolution is not purely celebratory. It maintains a comedic tone that avoids overly sentimental closure. The institutional response remains partially skeptical, reinforcing the idea that systemic change is slow and resistant. Structurally, Down Periscope follows a three-act framework: setup, competition, and resolution. However, within that framework, it borrows heavily from sports comedy and ensemble adventure storytelling. The submarine exercise functions as a substitute for a tournament bracket, with each encounter serving as a mini-challenge that builds toward the final confrontation. At first glance, Down Periscope appears to be a straightforward military comedy built around slapstick humor eccentric characters, and an underdog competition structure. However, beneath its comedic surface, the film engages with several recurring themes related to leadership, institutional rigidity, identity, and the tension between tradition and innovation. While these ideas are not explored in a heavy-handed or overtly philosophical way, they are consistently embedded in character behavior, narrative structure, and visual contrast. One of the most prominent themes in the film is unconventional leadership versus institutional authority. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dodge represents a leadership style rooted in adaptability, intuition, and psychological awareness rather than strict adherence to protocol. In contrast, the Navy hierarchy is portrayed as rigid, rule-bound, and overly dependent on established systems of evaluation. The film uses this contrast to explore the idea that leadership effectiveness is not always aligned with formal recognition or traditional metrics of success. Dodge's methods often appear chaotic or unorthodox, but they consistently produce results, challenging the assumption that authority structures are inherently correct. Closely tied to this is the theme of outsider competence. Many of the crew members aboard Dodge's submarine are individuals who have been sidelined or undervalued by the institution. They are not elite performers within the traditional Navy framework, yet they become highly effective when placed in an environment that values flexibility and collaboration. This theme reinforces the idea that institutional systems often fail to recognize talent that does not conform to standard expectations. The submarine becomes a symbolic space where misfits can succeed precisely because the usual rules are suspended or ineffective. Another important theme is adaptation under constraint. The submarine itself is a key symbolic element in this regard. It is outdated, inefficient, and technologically inferior compared to its competitors. However, these limitations force creativity. Instead of relying on advanced systems, the crew must develop improvised solutions and rely on teamwork. The submarine becomes a metaphor for operating under scarcity, where success is determined not by resources, but by ingenuity. This reinforces a broader message that limitations can sometimes generate innovation rather than inhibit it. The film also explores the tension between order and chaos. The Navy represents order, discipline, and predictability, while Dodge and his crew introduce controlled chaos into that system. However, the film does not present chaos as purely destructive. Instead, it suggests that structured environments can benefit from a degree of unpredictability. The humor often arises from moments where strict procedures are disrupted by unexpected actions, revealing the fragility of overly rigid systems. This thematic tension is visually reinforced through the contrast between clean, modern submarines and the older, worn-down vessel commanded by Dodge. A subtle but recurring theme is identity and self-definition within institutions. Several characters struggle with how they are perceived by the Navy versus how they see themselves. Dodge, in particular, is defined externally as a failure or liability, but internally he operates with confidence in his own approach to leadership. The film suggests that institutional labels do not always reflect individual capability. The submarine becomes a space where identity can be redefined outside the constraints of formal evaluation. Another layer of thematic content involves teamwork and collective intelligence. While Dodge is a central leader, the film emphasizes that success is not the result of one individual's brilliance alone. Instead, it emerges from the coordinated efforts of a diverse group of personalities. Each crew member contributes specific skills, perspectives, or problem-solving approaches that become essential during the naval exercise. This reinforces the idea that effective systems rely on collaboration rather than hierarchical control. Symbolically, the submarine itself functions as one of the most important elements in the film. It represents both isolation and unity. On one hand, it is a confined environment that physically separates the crew from the outside world. On the other hand, this confinement forces interpersonal cooperation and mutual reliance. The submarine can be interpreted as a microcosm of society, where individuals must learn to function together despite differences in personality, competence, and perspective. The ocean environment surrounding the submarine also carries symbolic weight. It represents uncertainty, vastness, and unpredictability. Unlike land-based settings, the ocean offers no stable reference points, reinforcing the idea that the characters are operating in an environment where control is limited. This external uncertainty mirrors the internal instability of the Navy exercise itself, where rules are flexible and outcomes are uncertain. The opposing submarines in the film symbolize technological superiority and institutional confidence. They are sleek, modern, and highly efficient, representing the belief that advancement and success are tied to resources and structure. However, their repeated failure to adapt to Dodge's unconventional tactics challenges this symbolism. The film uses these vessels to critique over-reliance on technology without corresponding adaptability. Another symbolic layer exists in the contrast between uniforms and individuality. Military uniforms typically represent conformity and hierarchy, but within the film, small variations in behavior and personality consistently break through this visual uniformity. Characters express individuality through speech patterns, reactions, and decision-making styles, suggesting that identity cannot be fully suppressed by institutional dress codes or structure. The film also subtly engages with the theme of perception versus reality. Many characters within the Navy system initially perceive Dodge's crew as incompetent or doomed to fail. However, reality consistently contradicts these expectations. This recurring reversal reinforces the idea that perception is shaped by bias and institutional assumptions rather than objective evaluation. The humor often emerges from these gaps between expectation and outcome. The visual style of Down Periscope is shaped by a clear intention to balance the confined mechanical realism of a submarine environment with the exaggerated timing and clarity required for broad ensemble comedy. Unlike darker or more tension-driven submarine films that emphasize shadow, claustrophobia, and psychological pressure, this film adopts a brighter, more readable visual approach that prioritizes comedic visibility, character interaction, and spatial clarity over atmospheric realism. At the core of the cinematography is the challenge of filming in extremely tight spaces. Submarine interiors are naturally narrow, segmented, and low-lit environments, which can make camera movement and framing difficult. The film addresses this by using carefully constructed soundstage sets that allow for removable walls and adjustable compartments. This design choice gives the cinematography team the flexibility to place cameras in positions that would be impossible in a real submarine, enabling clearer framing of group interactions and physical comedy sequences. The camera work frequently favors medium shots and wide ensemble compositions. This is a deliberate stylistic decision that allows multiple characters to be visible within the frame at the same time, which is essential for a comedy that relies heavily on overlapping dialogue and reaction-based humor. Rather than isolating characters in close-ups, the film often keeps them within shared visual space, reinforcing the sense of crowded, constantly active environment. This approach also supports comedic timing, as reactions from background characters often contribute to humor of a scene. When close-ups are used, they are typically reserved for punchlines, reactions, or moments of heightened absurdity. These close-ups are not stylized in a dramatic sense, but are instead functional, designed to isolate facial expressions that deliver comedic payoff. The contrast between wide ensemble shots and sudden close-ups helps structure the rhythm of jokes visually, guiding the audience's attention to the most important reaction within a busy frame. Lighting plays a significant role in shaping the film's visual identity. Submarine environments in more serious films are often depicted with heavy shadow, dim industrial lighting, and a cold color palette. In contrast, Down Periscope uses relatively even and practical lighting that ensures characters remain clearly visible at all times. While the setting still retains a metallic and industrial feel, the lighting is softened to avoid obscuring facial expressions or action within the frame. This choice reflects the film's priority: clarity over realism. The color palette of the film leans toward muted blues, grays, and metallic tones, consistent with naval interiors. However, it avoids extreme desaturation. The result is a visual environment that feels authentic enough to suggest a military setting, but still visually accessible and warm enough to support comedy. The submarine interiors are not visually oppressive. Instead, they are designed to feel functional and slightly worn, reinforcing the idea that this vessel is outdated but still operational. Camera movement in the film is generally restrained but purposeful. Because of the confined environment, there is limited opportunity for sweeping motion. Instead, the cinematography relies on subtle tracking shots, lateral movements through corridors, and carefully timed pans that follow dialogue exchanges or character entrances. These movements are often motivated by character action rather than purely aesthetic intent, ensuring that the camera remains anchored in the physical logic of the submarine. One of the most important visual techniques used in the film is spatial layering. Scenes are frequently composed with multiple depth levels, allowing foreground, midground, and background action to occur simultaneously. For example, a character might be speaking in the foreground while another performs a comedic reaction or task in the background. This layered composition enhances the sense of a living, active environment and allows humor to emerge organically from visual context rather than isolated staging. The production design strongly influences the cinematographic choices. The submarine interior is filled with pipes, control panels, ladders, and narrow passageways, all of which create natural framing devices. The cinematographer often uses these structural elements to frame characters within compartments or through circular hatches, reinforcing the sense of confinement while also adding visual variety. These framing techniques help break up what could otherwise become visually monotonous interior scenes. Exterior shots of submarines and naval exercises introduce a different visual tone. These sequences are more open, expansive, and water-focused, contrasting sharply with confined interiors. The ocean environment allows for wider compositions and more traditional establishing shots. These visuals help situate the submarine within a larger operational context and provide breathing room between interior comedic sequences. The contrast between interior confinement and exterior openness is a recurring visual rhythm throughout the film. Special effects and model work are used sparingly but effectively in depicting submarine movement and underwater operations. Rather than relying heavily on large-scale visual effects, the film integrates practical models and controlled water tank shots. These sequences are framed in a way that emphasizes clarity over spectacle, ensuring that the audience always understands the position and movement of the submarines during the exercise. The effects are functional rather than immersive, supporting the narrative rather than dominating it. The editing rhythm also contributes significantly to the film's visual style. Cuts are generally quick enough to maintain comedic timing, but not so rapid as to disorient the viewer within confined environment. The editing prioritizes reaction shots, especially in ensemble scenes, where humor often arises from the interplay between multiple characters responding to the same event in different ways. This creates a visual rhythm built around anticipation and payoff. The soundtrack and sound design of Down Periscope play a crucial but often understated role in shaping the film's comedic rhythm, atmosphere, and sense of immersion. While the film is primarily driven by dialogue and situational humor, its audio elements provide structure, energy, and environmental believability. The soundscape must simultaneously support a confined submarine setting, clarify ensemble interactions, and enhance comedic timing, without overwhelming the narrative. The musical score is generally light, rhythmic, and adventure-oriented in tone, rather than leaning into dramatic orchestration or suspense-heavy motifs common in traditional military or submarine films. The music in Down Periscope maintains a playful and upbeat character. This tonal choice is essential because it signals to the audience that the story is comedic rather than tense or dramatic. Even during moments of naval competition or simulated combat scenarios, the music avoids excessive intensity, instead reinforcing the film's underlying sense of control, chaos, and playful rivalry. One of the key functions of the soundtrack is to establish transitions between narrative phases. The film is structured around preparation, competition, and escalation, and the score helps smooth these shifts. Light thematic cues often accompany montage sequences, particularly those involving crew training, submarine preparation, or early operational adjustments. These musical segments help compress time and reinforce the sense of progress as the crew becomes more cohesive and capable. During competitive sequences, the music becomes more rhythmically active but still maintains a comedic undertone. Percussive elements and playful motifs are often used to mirror the tension between submarines without turning the film into a serious action thriller. This balancing act is central to the film's identity. It must acknowledge the stakes of naval exercises while still keeping the audience anchored in humor. Sound effects are particularly important in establishing the submarine environment. The mechanical nature of the vessel is communicated through a constant layer of ambient audio. Humming engines, metallic creaks, hydraulic systems, sonar pings, and communication signals. These sounds create a sense of operational realism, reinforcing that the characters are inside a functioning military machine. Even though the submarine is outdated and imperfect, the sound design ensures it still feels mechanically alive. Sonar sounds play a symbolic and functional role in the film's audio landscape. They are used not only to indicate tactical awareness, but also to punctuate comedic beats. The repetitive pinging of sonar systems becomes a rhythmic audio motif that can signal discovery, tension, or confusion depending on context. In some cases, sonar alerts are used ironically, emphasizing the gap between the seriousness of military systems and the absurdity of the situations unfolding on screen. Internal communication systems are another key component of the sound design. Dialogue transmitted through intercoms, radios, and command channels often carries slight distortion, reinforcing the technological environment of the submarine. These audio filters help differentiate between direct conversation and system-mediated communication, making it easier for the audience to follow spatial relationships within the vessel. The layered communication also contributes to comedic timing, as miscommunications or delayed responses become part of the humor. The film makes extensive use of overlapping dialogue, especially in ensemble scenes. The sound mixing is carefully managed to ensure clarity despite multiple characters speaking or reacting simultaneously. This is particularly challenging in a comedy set within tight physical spaces, where conversation density is high. The sound design prioritizes intelligibility while still preserving the sense of chaos and constant activity aboard the submarine. Ambient sound is continuously used to reinforce spatial confinement. The echo of footsteps in narrow corridors, the closing of heavy doors, and mechanical locking compartments all contribute to the feeling of enclosed space. These sounds are not just background detail. They actively shape the viewer's perception of the submarine as a sealed, self-contained environment where every action produces audible consequences. One of the subtle achievements of sound design is how it differentiates between interior and exterior environments. Inside the submarine, sounds are muted, metallic, and enclosed. Outside sequences, particularly those involving surface ships or underwater movement, have a more open acoustic quality. This contrast helps the audience mentally distinguish between spatial environments even when visual cues are limited. Comedic timing is heavily supported by sound cues. Many jokes are punctuated by mechanical noises, abrupt silences, or exaggerated system alerts. These audio elements function almost like punchline markers, guiding audience attention and reinforcing humorous beats. For example, a sudden sonar ping or alarm can interrupt a serious moment, immediately shifting tone and triggering comedic reaction from the characters. Silence is also used strategically. In certain moments, the reduction or absence of ambient sound creates comedic tension. This is particularly effective in confined environments where silence feels unnatural. When systems momentarily quiet down, or when characters pause in anticipation, the absence of sound heightens audience expectation before comedic payoff occurs. The film's use of military jargon and procedural language within its audio landscape adds another layer of authenticity. Commands, status reports, and operational updates are delivered in a structured and formal tone, contrasting with the chaotic behavior of the crew. This verbal rigidity enhances the comedic contrast between institutional language and unpredictable human behavior. Sound design also plays a role in character differentiation. Certain characters are associated with specific audio environments, such as frequent radio communication, mechanical interaction, or command-driven dialogue. This helps establish identity through auditory patterns, allowing the audience to recognize roles and responsibilities even without visual focus. Upon its release in 1996, Down Periscope entered a competitive landscape of mid-budget Hollywood comedies that often relied on star power and high-concept premises rather than critical prestige. The film's reception reflected this positioning clearly. Audiences were moderately receptive, while critics were generally mixed and negative, with appreciation largely focused on its cast rather than its narrative depth or originality. Over time, the film settled into a category often described as a light comfort comedy, rather than a standout critical success. From a critical standpoint, one of the most common observations was that the film leaned heavily on familiar comedic structures. Reviewers often noted that the underdog military story had been explored many times before, and that Down Periscope did not significantly reinvent the formula. The narrative of an unorthodox commander leading a misfit crew to unexpected success was seen as predictable, even if competently executed. Critics tended to view the film as more of a collection of comedic moments than a tightly innovative story. Another frequent point of criticism was tonal inconsistency. Some reviewers felt the film struggled to balance its military setting with its slapstick and ensemble comedy style. While the humor was appreciated in parts, there was a perception that the film did not fully commit to either satire or grounded military parody. This led to an impression that the film occupied a middle ground that was entertaining, but not particularly sharp or memorable in a critical sense. Despite these critiques, the performances were widely recognized as the film's strongest element. Kelsey Grammer's portrayal of Lieutenant Commander Dodge was often highlighted as charismatic and effective, with critics acknowledging his ability to carry the film's comedic timing and leadership presence. Similarly, the supporting cast, including established character actors, was frequently praised for elevated material that might otherwise have felt routine. The ensemble nature of the film helped mitigate some of the criticisms directed at its screenplay. Audience reception, however, was somewhat more positive than critical reception. General moviegoers responded well to the film's accessible humor, ensemble dynamics, and lighthearted tone. The submarine setting, combined with recognizable military tropes and exaggerated character types, made it easy for audiences to engage without requiring deep investment or interpretation. For many viewers, the film functioned as an enjoyable, straightforward comedy rather than a work intended for analysis or critique. In theaters, Down Periscope achieved modest box office performance. It was not a major blockbuster, but performed adequately within its release window, particularly considering its mid-range budget and lack of heavy special effects competition. Its financial results placed in the category of commercially acceptable comedies of the era. Profitable enough to be considered a success in a limited sense, but not strong enough to establish it as a major cultural hit. Over time, the film's reception shifted slightly in the context of home video and television broadcasts. As it became more widely accessible outside of theaters, Down Periscope developed a secondary audience that appreciated it as a casual, rewatchable comedy. This kind of long-term consumption often softens initial critical judgments, allowing films to be reassessed based on entertainment value, rather than theatrical expectations. In television reruns and cable programming, the film found a stable niche. It became the type of movie that could be watched without requiring full attention, yet still deliver consistent humor and familiar character dynamics. This contributed to its reputation as a dependable ensemble comedy, rather than a critically prestigious work. For many viewers, repeated exposure helped solidify its comedic beats and character interactions, even if it did not elevate its critical standing. In terms of awards recognition, the film did not receive major nominations from prominent industry institutions. This absence is consistent with its genre and reception profile. Military comedies of this nature typically fall outside award consideration unless they achieve exceptional critical acclaim or cultural impact, neither of which applied strongly in this case. As a result, Down Periscope remained primarily evaluated on entertainment value rather than artistic achievement. Some critics did, however, acknowledge the film's effectiveness as a parody of military structure. While not considered deeply satirical, it was recognized for gently mocking bureaucracy, hierarchy, and procedural rigidity within the Navy context. These elements were often appreciated in retrospect more than at the time of release, as viewers and analysts later identified the film's contribution to the broader tradition of institutional comedy. There were no significant controversies surrounding the film. Its subject matter, tone, and humor were broadly inoffensive by mainstream standards of the time. Unlike more provocative comedies that push boundaries in terms of content or social commentary, Down Periscope remained within safe comedic territory. This contributed to its accessibility, but also limited its potential for strong critical distinction. One of the more interesting aspects of its reception history is how differently it is perceived depending on viewing context. In a theatrical environment, where expectations for originality and impact are higher, the film was seen as average. In contrast, in casual or television viewing contexts, it is often perceived more favorably, as its episodic humor and ensemble interactions become more prominent than structural predictability. The legacy of Down Periscope is best understood not through major cultural dominance or blockbuster influence, but through its steady, long-term presence as a recognizable example of 1990s military comedy filmmaking. It did not redefine the genre or create a wave of direct imitators, but remains part of a broader lineage of ensemble workplace comedies set within rigid institutions. Its influence is subtle, indirect, and often absorbed into the general evolution of comedic storytelling rather than credited as a primary catalyst. One of the clearest aspects of its legacy is its contribution to the continued viability of military parody comedies. While earlier films had already established a template for humor within military environments, Down Periscope reinforced the idea that highly technical or hierarchical systems could be reinterpreted as comedic playgrounds. After its release, military-themed comedies continued to appear in both film and television, often using similar structures: a misfit leader, an underdog team, and an institution resistant to unconventional methods. The film helped sustain audience familiarity with this formula, even if it did not originate it. The film also plays a role in the broader legacy of submarine storytelling in popular culture. Submarine films are typically associated with tension, isolation, and psychological pressure. Down Periscope stands out because it reframes an environment as comedic and collaborative rather than suspense-driven. While it did not replace the serious submarine genre, it demonstrated that the setting could support tonal variation. Later comedic or lighthearted references to submarines in media often rely on the idea that such environments can be both claustrophobic and absurd, a balance this film helped normalize. In terms of influence on filmmakers, Down Periscope is not typically cited as a major inspiration for specific works, but it fits into a broader tradition of ensemble comedy construction that many later films and television shows continue to use. The structure of assembling a dysfunctional team, placing them in a competitive or high-pressure environment, and allowing character-driven humor to emerge through interaction remains a widely used formula. The film's execution reinforces the effectiveness of this structure, particularly in settings that naturally limit space and increase interpersonal friction. The film also contributes to the continued screen presence of its lead actors in specific archetypes. Kelsey Grammer's role as a competent but unconventional leader aligns with a recurring character type that is revisited in various forms throughout his career. While not the defining role of his filmography, it reinforces ability to carry ensemble comedies outside of television. In this sense, the film supports the broader legacy of television actors successfully transitioning into theatrical ensemble roles during the 1990s. For supporting actors, the film fits into the larger pattern of reliable character performers maintaining consistent visibility across multiple genres. Actors such as William H. Macy, Bruce Dern, and others continue to appear in a wide range of projects, and Down Periscope is one example of their involvement in mainstream studio comedies during a period when such ensemble films were particularly common. The film does not define their careers, but it contributes to their extensive portfolios of supporting roles that demonstrate versatility. In terms of genre legacy, Down Periscope is part of the decline of large-scale mid-budget studio comedies that were prominent in the 1990s. As Hollywood moved into the 2000s and beyond, comedy production increasingly shifted toward either high-concept star vehicles or lower-budget independent-style productions. Films like Down Periscope represent a specific era where studios were willing to invest in ensemble casts, modern production values, and concept-driven comedies without expecting blockbuster-level returns. Its legacy is therefore partly historical. It reflects a production model that has become less common over time. The film also maintains a modest legacy through television and streaming circulation. While it is not a major franchise property or a heavily referenced cultural artifact, it continues to appear periodically in programming schedules and streaming libraries. This ongoing accessibility contributes to its status as a familiar, if not iconic, comedy from its era. For many viewers who encounter outside of its original release context, it functions as a representative example of 1990s military humor rather than a specific cultural milestone. In discussions of naval or military comedy, Down Periscope is sometimes referenced alongside other films that use structured institutions as comedic environments. Its contribution in this context is not innovation but reinforcement. It demonstrates how hierarchy, discipline, and technical systems can be reinterpreted through character-based humor. This interpretive approach has continued to appear in later comedic storytelling, particularly in ensemble workplace settings where authority structures are intentionally exaggerated or undermined for comedic effect. Merchandising and franchise expansion were not significant aspects of the film's legacy. Unlike major comedy hits that generate sequels or spin-off properties, Down Periscope remained a standalone film. This limits its commercial legacy but also reinforces its identity as a self-contained narrative. Its influence is therefore more structural than commercial, contributing to genre patterns rather than franchise ecosystems. Audience reflection on Down Periscope has always been shaped by context, expectation, and the type of viewing experience people bring to it. Unlike films that generate strong, polarized reactions or intense fandoms, this movie tends to produce a more uniform response. Light enjoyment, recognition of familiar comedic patterns, and an appreciation for an ensemble cast. Over time, however, interpretations have subtly shifted as different generations have encountered it under different cultural conditions. For audiences in the mid-1990s, the film arrived as a straightforward theatrical comedy in a crowded marketplace of similar ensemble-driven films. Viewers at the time generally approached it with the expectation of light entertainment rather than artistic depth. Many appreciated its accessible humor, military setting, and the novelty of seeing a submarine environment treated as a comedic stage. For this generation, the film functioned as a casual theater experience, something enjoyable in the moment, but not necessarily discussed in depth afterward. One of the most common audience reactions across generations is the appreciation of character dynamics over plot complexity. Viewers often remember the interactions between crew members more than specific narrative details. The ensemble cast structure encourages this type of engagement, where humor emerges from personalities rather than intricate storytelling. As a result, audiences tend to recall specific scenes, reactions, or comedic exchanges rather than the full competitive structure of the naval exercise. For many viewers, the film also resonates as a comfort watch experience. This interpretation has become more common over time, especially in television and streaming contexts. The film's predictable structure, familiar character archetypes, and episodic humor make it easy to watch without requiring sustained attention. Audiences often describe it as relaxing or familiar rather than intellectually demanding. This type of reception is important because it reflects how films can evolve in meaning based on viewing habits rather than initial theatrical intent. Different generations interpret the film slightly differently. Older audiences who encountered it during its release period often associate with the broader landscape of 1990s comedy films, which were characterized by ensemble casts, workplace humor, and institutional satire. For them, Down Periscope fits naturally into a category of films that prioritize entertainment over innovation, and is often remembered alongside other comedies of the same era, rather than as a standalone cultural landmark. Younger audiences who discover the film later often view it through a more detached lens. Without the context of its original era, they may perceive it as a somewhat traditional or formulaic comedy. However, many still respond positively to its straightforward humor and clear character archetypes. In some cases, younger viewers interpret the film as an example of older Hollywood comedic structure, where pacing is slower and jokes are more situational than rapid-fire or reference-based. A recurring theme in audience interpretation is the underdog narrative appeal. Many viewers connect emotionally with the idea of a disadvantaged team overcoming expectations. Even when the comedic tone is light, the underlying structure of struggle, adaptation, and eventual success resonates on a basic narrative level. This makes a film accessible across different audience groups, even if interpretations of its depth vary. Another common audience perspective is the appreciation of ensemble chemistry. Viewers often highlight how the cast works together rather than focusing on individual performances alone. The submarine setting creates a sense of forced proximity, which audiences interpret as both humorous and engaging. This contributes to the feeling that the film is more about group dynamics than individual heroism, even though it is centered around a lead character. Some audiences also interpret the film as a gentle satire of authority systems, even if it is not overtly political. The depiction of rigid naval hierarchy contrasted with improvisational leadership leads some viewers to read the film as a commentary on bureaucracy and inefficiency. However, this interpretation tends to remain light and non-controversial, as the film never pushes these ideas into serious critique. Instead, audiences generally perceive it as playful rather than ideological. In television and streaming contexts, audience engagement often becomes fragmented. Viewers may watch the film in parts or as background entertainment, which changes how it is interpreted. In these settings, the film's episodic structure becomes more noticeable, and audiences tend to focus on individual scenes rather than the full narrative arc. This reinforces its reputation as an easy-to-consume comedy rather than a tightly structured cinematic experience. Online discussions and informal reviews often describe the film as underrated or forgotten, though not in a passionate or corrective sense. Instead, these labels reflect mild appreciation rather than strong advocacy. Viewers who revisit it later in life sometimes express nostalgia, associating it with a simpler era of comedy filmmaking, even if they do not rank among their favorite films. There is also a tendency for audiences to interpret the film differently depending on their familiarity with military environments or naval terminology. For viewers with no military background, the film reads primarily as a workplace comedy set in an unusual environment. For those with more familiarity, some of the procedural elements and hierarchical interactions may carry additional meaning, even if presented humorously. Emotionally, the film tends to produce a consistent response: mild amusement, occasional laughter, and a general sense of enjoyment without emotional intensity. It does not typically provoke strong emotional investment, sadness, or excitement. Instead, it occupies a middle emotional register that aligns with its role as a light ensemble comedy. The character development in Down Periscope is structured less around deep psychological transformation and more around functional growth within a constrained, high-pressure environment. The film is not a traditional character study. Instead, it uses archetypal personalities who evolve through teamwork, adaptation, and shifting perceptions of competence. The arcs are clear, accessible, and designed to support the ensemble comedy structure rather than dominate it. At the center is Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dodge, whose character arc is the most defined and thematically important. At the beginning of the film, Dodge is established as an unconventional naval officer whose career has been repeatedly stalled due to his disregard for strict protocol. He is seen by the institution as unreliable, difficult to control, and incompatible with traditional command structures. However, the film immediately challenges his perception by placing him in command of a deliberately underpowered submarine. Dodge's development is not about becoming more conventional, but about validating his unconventional approach. Early in the story, he operates with confidence, but also with a sense of being underestimated. As the narrative progresses, his leadership style is tested through practical challenges rather than theoretical evaluation. He begins to refine his approach not by changing who he is, but by better understanding how to apply his instincts to a team environment. His arc ultimately confirms that adaptability and intuition can be as effective as formal discipline. A key aspect of Dodge's development is his transition from individual maverick to effective team leader. While he is initially portrayed as someone who operates outside the system, he gradually becomes more focused on integrating his crew into a cohesive unit. His success depends less on personal brilliance alone, and more on his ability to recognize strengths in others and coordinate them effectively. This shift is subtle but important. It transforms him from a lone operator into a facilitator of collective performance. Lieutenant Emily Lake serves as a stabilizing counterpart to Dodge and undergoes a more restrained but meaningful arc. Initially, she approaches Dodge's leadership style with skepticism, representing a more structured and technically grounded perspective. She is oriented towards systems, efficiency, and conventional naval procedures. Throughout the film, her arc involves gradually recognizing the practical effectiveness of Dodge's methods, even when they appear unorthodox or chaotic. Her development is less about abandoning structure and more about expanding her understanding of effective problem-solving. She learns that technical expertise alone is not always sufficient in unpredictable conditions, and that adaptability and improvisation can play a critical role in operational success. By the end of the film, she is more willing to engage with unconventional approaches while still maintaining her professional identity. The supporting crew members collectively represent a group arc rather than individual transformations. At the beginning, they are presented as misfits, underperformers, or individuals who do not fit traditional naval expectations. Their development is tied to their integration into a functioning unit under Dodge's leadership. Rather than undergoing radical personal change, they become more effective versions of themselves within a supportive structure. This group arc is driven by three key developments: trust, coordination, and confidence. Initially, the crew lacks cohesion and operates as disconnected individuals. Over time, repeated challenges force them to rely on one another, gradually building trust. Coordination improves as they learn each other's roles and communication styles. Confidence emerges as they begin to see tangible success during the naval exercises. By the end, the crew functions as a synchronized team rather than a collection of individuals. Lieutenant Commander Martin Pascal functions as a narrative foil to Dodge and represents a more traditional arc of rigid adherence to structure, leading to limited adaptability. Unlike Dodge, Pascal does not significantly evolve in his worldview. Instead, his arc is defined by increasing frustration as his structured approach is repeatedly challenged by unpredictable outcomes. His lack of flexibility serves as a contrast that reinforces the film's central thematic tension between order and improvisation. The senior Navy officers who observe and oversee the exercise represent a different type of static characterization. They serve primarily as institutional benchmarks rather than evolving individuals. Their role is to evaluate, judge, and enforce expectations rather than participate in transformation. Their lack of significant character development emphasizes the rigidity of the system they represent. A subtle but important element of character progression in the film is the development of mutual respect among the crew and leadership figures. While this is not always explicitly stated, it becomes evident through changing interactions, communication patterns, and willingness to follow unconventional commands. Respect is earned through demonstrated competence rather than formal authority, reinforcing the film's broader message about leadership effectiveness. Another layer of character development lies in communication evolution. Early in the film, communication aboard the submarine is fragmented, hierarchical, and often inefficient. As the crew becomes more cohesive, communication becomes faster, more direct, and more adaptive. This shift reflects not only improved teamwork, but also a deeper understanding of shared purpose. It is also important to note that character arcs in Down Periscope are intentionally kept light and functional. The film does not aim for emotional transformation in the dramatic sense. There are no major personal tragedies, psychological breakdowns, or profound moral reckonings. Instead, the arcs are designed to support comedic structure and narrative progression. Growth is measured in effectiveness, coordination, and situational success rather than emotional intensity. The costume and set design of Down Periscope play a foundational role in establishing the film's identity, supporting both its comedic tone and its depiction of naval hierarchy. While the story is driven by characters and situational humor, the visual environment, especially uniforms, control rooms, corridors, and submarine interiors, provides a structural language that communicates rank, discipline, and institutional contrast. Every visual element is carefully designed to reinforce the tension between strict military order and the chaotic energy introduced by the film's central characters. The most immediately recognizable aspect of the costume design is the use of standard United States Navy uniforms, adapted for cinematic clarity and character differentiation. Military uniforms are inherently symbolic, representing rank, authority, and responsibility. In the film, these uniforms are not only accurate to a general naval aesthetic, but also slightly adjusted in terms of visual readability. Insignia, stripes, and rank markers are emphasized to ensure that the audience can quickly identify hierarchy during fast-paced ensemble scenes. This is essential in a film where multiple officers interact within confined spaces and decisions are made rapidly. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dodge's uniform reflects his status, but also subtly reinforces his outsider identity. While he maintains the correct structure of a commanding officer's attire, his presentation is slightly less rigid than that of more traditional officers. This visual distinction is not dramatic, but noticeable enough to suggest personality within institutional boundaries. His uniform becomes a visual compromise between authority and individuality, reflecting his role as someone who operates within the system, but not entirely according to its norms. Lieutenant Emily Lake's costume design emphasizes professionalism and technical competence. Her uniform is clean, precise, and functionally aligned with her engineering role. Unlike more rigidly formal officers, her presentation communicates practicality over ceremonial authority. This distinction helps visually reinforce her identity as someone grounded in systems and functionality rather than hierarchy alone. Her costume supports her narrative role as a bridge between technical expertise and evolving adaptability. The supporting crew members were variations of standard naval uniforms that subtly reflect their lower rank or less formal integration into the system. These variations are not exaggerated, but are used to create visual texture within the ensemble. Slight differences in fit, insignia placement, and uniform maintenance help communicate the idea that this crew is not elite or polished, but functional and diverse in background. One of the key design strengths of the film lies in how uniforms are used to visually reinforce institutional hierarchy. In group scenes, rank is immediately readable through costume alone, allowing the narrative to progress without excessive exposition. This is especially important in a submarine setting where space is limited and multiple characters frequently share the frame. Costume design ensures that authority structures remain visually clear even during chaotic or comedic sequences. Beyond costumes, the set design of the submarine itself is one of the most important visual achievements of the film. The interior of the submarine is constructed as a fully realized, multi-level environment composed of narrow corridors, control rooms, sleeping quarters, engine spaces, and communication stations. The design prioritizes realism in layout while allowing flexibility for filming and comedic staging. The submarine interior is deliberately claustrophobic but navigable. Corridors are tight, doors are heavy, and compartments are closely packed, reflecting the real-world constraints of submarine architecture. However, the design is also optimized for camera movement and ensemble interaction. Walls are often removable, and sections of the set are modular, allowing scenes to be shot from multiple angles without breaking spatial continuity. The control room is one of the most visually important set pieces. It functions as a command center of the submarine and is designed with layered instrumentation, consoles, screens, and communication devices. The layout emphasizes density of information and operational complexity. Despite this complexity, the design remains readable on screen, ensuring that the audience can follow key actions and dialogue exchanges without confusion. The control room also serves as a primary stage for leadership interactions, making it both a narrative and visual focal point. Engine rooms and mechanical areas are designed to emphasize industrial functionality. Pipes, valves, gauges, and machinery fill the space, reinforcing the idea that the submarine is an aging but operational machine. These areas are often used for physical comedy sequences, where characters interact with equipment in exaggerated or unexpected ways. The design supports this by ensuring that machinery is both visually prominent and physically accessible for actors. Lighting within the set design is closely integrated with the visual environment. Submarine interiors are typically dark and utilitarian, but the film adjusts this reality for cinematic clarity. Practical lighting sources such as overhead panels, instrument displays, and corridor fixtures are enhanced to ensure visibility. The result is a space that still feels industrial but is bright enough to support facial expression and ensemble interaction. This balance is critical for maintaining comedic readability. The exterior design of submarines, shown through models and surface sequences, contrasts with the interior environment. Exterior vessels are sleek, structured, and visually streamlined, representing technological superiority and institutional advancement. This contrast reinforces a narrative divide between modern naval power and the outdated but resourceful submarine commanded by Dodge. Set design also plays an important role in reinforcing spatial hierarchy. The submarine is organized vertically and horizontally in a way that reflects military structure. Command areas are positioned centrally and elevated in importance, while support and mechanical spaces are more isolated or deeper within the vessel. This spatial organization mirrors a chain of command and helps the audience intuitively understand authority relationships. The dialogue and script writing of Down Periscope are built around a clear objective: delivering fast, accessible comedy within a structured military environment while maintaining narrative clarity in an ensemble setting. The screenplay does not rely on dense philosophical language or highly layered subtext. Instead, it emphasizes character-driven exchanges, situational humor, and institutional contrast. The writing style reflects mid-1990s Hollywood comedy conventions, where personality archetypes and clear comedic beats often take priority over intricate dialogue construction. At the center of the script is the voice of Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dodge, whose dialogue defines much of the film's tone. His lines are typically confident, measured, and slightly irreverent toward authority. He often communicates in a way that blends military terminology with casual sarcasm, creating a contrast between institutional language and personal attitude. This combination helps establish him as both a legitimate authority figure and an outsider within the system. His dialogue is designed to project leadership, while subtly undermining rigid expectations of how a commander should speak. One of the defining features of the script is its use of contrast-based humor. Many jokes are structured around the gap between expectation and reality. For example, formal military procedures are often followed by unexpected outcomes or reactions that undercut their seriousness. The dialogue frequently sets up a structured, authoritative tone only to have it disrupted by comedic interpretation or character response. This pattern creates a rhythm where seriousness is constantly balanced by humor. The ensemble nature of the script means that dialogue is distributed across multiple characters rather than centered on long monologues. Conversations often involve overlapping perspectives, quick exchanges, and reaction-based humor. This structure allows multiple comedic threads to operate simultaneously within the same scene. The writing prioritizes timing and interaction over extended exposition, ensuring that scenes remain dynamic and engaging even in confined settings like submarine interiors. Lieutenant Emily Lake's dialogue serves a grounding function within the script. Her lines are typically precise, technical, and pragmatic, reflecting her engineering background. She often responds to Dodge's unconventional ideas with skepticism or analytical questioning. This creates a consistent conversational tension that helps structure many of their interactions. Over time, her dialogue shifts subtly from resistance to measured acceptance, reflecting her growing recognition of unconventional effectiveness without abandoning her professional mindset. Supporting characters contribute to the script's comedic texture through exaggerated personality-based dialogue. Each crew member is given distinct speech patterns, attitudes, or recurring verbal habits that help differentiate them within the ensemble. These variations ensure that even group scenes remain readable and dynamic, as each voice contributes a different comedic angle. Some characters rely on enthusiasm, others on confusion, and others on bureaucratic literalism, creating a layered conversational environment. A key feature of the script is its reliance on military jargon as comedic material. Technical terms, procedural commands, and operational language are frequently used in contexts that exaggerate or distort their seriousness. This creates humor through juxtaposition. Highly formal language is applied to situations that are chaotic, unpredictable, or absurd. The script does not mock military structure directly, but uses its language as a comedic tool to highlight the gap between system design and human behavior. The pacing of dialogue is carefully calibrated to match the film's ensemble structure. Conversations are generally concise, avoiding long speeches in favor of rapid exchanges. This allows scenes to maintain momentum, especially in a confined submarine environment where visual variety is limited. The script compensates for spatial restriction by increasing verbal dynamism, ensuring that energy remains high even in stationary settings. One of the strengths of the screenplay is its use of reaction-based humor. Many of the film's comedic moments are not driven by punchlines alone, but by how characters respond to unexpected developments. The script frequently builds situations where the initial line or command is straightforward, but the reaction from other characters provides a comedic payoff. This layered approach allows humor to emerge organically from interaction rather than relying solely on isolated jokes. The writing also incorporates structured escalation within dialogue sequences. Conversations often begin in a relatively normal or procedural tone and gradually become more exaggerated as misunderstandings, tactical improvisations, or personality clashes intensify. This escalation mirrors the broader narrative structure of the film, where controlled systems gradually give way to improvisational behavior. Another important aspect of the script is its use of situational clarity over verbal complexity. The dialogue is written to be immediately understandable, even when multiple conversations occur simultaneously. This is essential in a film where visual space is limited and multiple characters are often present in the same frame. The writing avoids ambiguity, ensuring that comedic intent is always clear to the audience. The screenplay also makes effective use of command and response structures, a pattern common in military communication. Orders are given, acknowledged, and then interpreted in unexpected ways. This structure creates natural comedic opportunities, as deviations from expected responses become sources of humor. The rigidity of command language contrasts with the unpredictability of execution, reinforcing one of the film's central comedic mechanisms. While the film is comedic in tone, the script occasionally incorporates moments of sincerity, particularly in scenes where teamwork and competence are demonstrated. These moments are not heavy or dramatic, but serve to balance the comedic rhythm. They allow the audience to see the functional success of the crew, which in turn reinforces the underdog narrative without disrupting the overall light tone. A comparative analysis of Down Periscope places the film within several overlapping categories: military comedies, ensemble workplace comedies, and 1990 studio-driven humor films. While it does not radically redefine any of these genres, it becomes more interesting when viewed alongside similar films and tonal counterparts. Its identity emerges most clearly through contrast with both serious submarine films and other comedic depictions of structured institutions. The most immediate comparison is with serious submarine films, particularly those focused on tension, psychological pressure, and military realism. In contrast to films like The Hunt for Red October, which emphasize strategic conflict, silence, and high-stakes geopolitical tension, Down Periscope deliberately dismantles that seriousness. Where traditional submarine films use confined space to heighten anxiety and claustrophobia, this film uses the same environment to generate comedic interaction and ensemble chaos. The submarine becomes less a symbol of isolation under pressure and more a mobile workplace filled with personality clashes and improvisation. This inversion is important because it highlights how genre can be reshaped by tone rather than setting. Both types of films rely on similar physical constraints: tight corridors, limited visibility, structured hierarchy, but they interpret those constraints differently. One emphasizes psychological stress, while the other emphasizes adaptability and humor. In this way, Down Periscope can be seen as a tonal counterpoint rather than a narrative competitor to serious submarine cinema. When compared to military comedies, such as Stripes, the similarities become more apparent. Both films rely on the idea of misfit groups placed within rigid military systems. Both feature unconventional leadership that challenges authority structures through humor and improvisation. However, Down Periscope narrows its focus significantly by placing the entire narrative in a single confined environment rather than a broader training or battlefield context. This creates a more concentrated ensemble dynamic, where interactions are continuous and unavoidable. In comparison to workplace ensemble comedies like Office Space or other institutional satire films, Down Periscope shares the theme of individuals navigating rigid systems that do not fully understand or accommodate them. However, the tone differs significantly. Workplace comedies often lean into cynicism or social critique, while Down Periscope remains more optimistic and playful. Its characters do not dismantle the system. Instead, they demonstrate success within it through unconventional means. This makes the film less satirical and more celebratory of adaptability. When compared to other 1990s ensemble comedies, such as those centered around sports teams or group competitions, Down Periscope fits neatly into the underdog competition formula. Like many films of its era, it builds narrative momentum through structured challenges, team assembly, and escalating tests of skill. However, the naval setting distinguishes it by replacing physical sports or corporate competition with simulated military exercises. This gives the film a more procedural structure than many of its comedic counterparts. In relation to the broader career of its lead actor, comparisons can be made with other Kelsey Grammer-led projects. His performance in Down Periscope contrasts with his more refined, intellectual television persona in Frasier. While Frasier focuses on verbal sophistication, psychological nuance, and social interaction in domestic or professional settings, Down Periscope places him in a physically constrained, ensemble-driven environment where leadership is demonstrated through action and improvisation. This demonstrates his range within different comedic frameworks, from cerebral sitcoms to physical ensemble comedy. Compared to other films featuring ensemble military misfits, Down Periscope is less chaotic than more exaggerated or anarchic comedies, but more structured than purely slapstick interpretations of military life. It occupies a middle ground where character archetypes are clearly defined but still flexible enough to interact dynamically. This balance gives it a distinct identity within the subgenre, neither fully absurd nor strictly realistic. Another useful comparison is with films that explore authority versus improvisation as a central theme. Many comedies use this tension, but Down Periscope frames it within a highly technical environment where systems and procedures matter. Unlike workplace comedies, where rebellion often leads to system collapse or satire, this film allows unconventional leadership to succeed within the structure itself. This makes its message more integrative than oppositional. Visually and structurally, the film can also be compared to other confined space ensemble films, where limited physical environments force increased interaction. In such comparisons, Down Periscope stands out for its use of layered staging and simultaneous comedic activity. Rather than isolating characters into separate narrative threads, it keeps them in constant shared proximity, which intensifies both humor and narrative cohesion. In contrast to later comedic styles that rely heavily on rapid cut editing, pop culture references, or fragmented storytelling, Down Periscope remains rooted in continuous scene interaction and situational humor. This places it closer to earlier ensemble traditions than to modern internet-influenced comedy structures. Its pacing and comedic rhythm reflect a pre-digital era of filmmaking where jokes are allowed to develop over longer exchanges. When compared to other submarine-themed media that incorporate humor, Down Periscope remains one of the more structured and accessible interpretations. It does not fully commit to parody, nor does it attempt to deconstruct the genre aggressively. Instead, it lightly bends expectations while preserving recognizable military frameworks. This makes it less radical but more broadly approachable than more experimental tonal hybrids.